Hello, everybody. Welcome. I will allow Lenny to do the welcome and honoring of the land.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lenny Ureña Valerio, and I'm the Associate Director for Program Development at the Latin American Iberian Institute at the University of New Mexico. The Latin American Iberian Institute is a unit on campus that promotes and supports interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. Latin America is designated as one of 7 priority areas of research for UNM, and we proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as global discourse through programming. We'd like to take a moment to recognize the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, on which UNM sits. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous people. I would like to welcome the panelists and thank them for taking the time to join us today. And I will now turn things over to Soledad Roybal, who will be moderating this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenny. Hello, everyone, and thank you. Thank you for joining us. And I'm super excited to introduce our panel on the path to an international nonprofit career. We're super excited to have with us 3 amazing people who've had incredibly impressive careers in both the domestic and international sectors. Please welcome Ernesto Archila, who is the Senior Advisor at Oxfam America. Emerita Torres, the Vice President of Policy, Research, and Advocacy for the Community Service Society of New York. And Lucero Ortiz, who is the Director for Partnerships and Capacity Building at Kids in Need of Defense in Mexico. So thank you all for joining us. Ernesto, Lucero, Emerita. We're just so lucky to have you and your knowledge and experience and your time to tell us about your path and things that you wish you had known when you started your journey. We'd love to get from you advice of what people at any age can get if they or what they should do should they want to pursue a career in the international nonprofit sector. For the audience, thank you so much for being here today. Please feel free to send me a message or raise your hand if you have a question. I'm happy to either call on you and let you turn on your camera and let you ask your question yourself. Or if you're not comfortable doing that, you can do it voice without turning on your camera, or feel free to send me your question in the chat and I'm happy to read it for you. So at any time, do feel free to send the questions or raise your hand. So let's jump into our first question. And I'm going to go in order of the way people are on my screen. And so it's going to be Ernesto, Emerita, and then Lucero. And I think my first question is just tell us a little bit about who you are, your current position, the organization, what your organization does, what you actually do at the organization, and what communities you work with. So Ernesto.
Sure, thank you. No, very much appreciate the chance to be here and have this conversation. So I currently work for Oxfam America, which is a global anti-poverty organization that works in over 90 countries to fight the injustice of poverty. We approach it from both a humanitarian assistance level, but also from a systemic level, seeking to change policies and systems and conditions that contribute to the injustice of poverty. So we both do humanitarian as well as advocacy work. We engage directly with governments. We support civil society organizations in partnership with them develop seek to develop solutions to fight the injustice of poverty. I sit in our private sector team, which primarily engages with multinational corporations to get them to do better. I'm also cross-matrixed with our U.S. domestic programs, so I actually primarily focus on the U.S. operations of companies, as well as leading our policy advocacy on labor issues at the federal level in the United States. I also work on international labor related issues and support our team on that. I most recently helped develop and launch a new voluntary living wage standard for US companies that want to pay their workers a living wage, to help them understand what that means and then hold them accountable to that commitment. And I'm currently working on some advocacy around human rights due diligence policies, potentially legislation in the US, as well as other activities in the advocacy space. So that's a long-winded way of saying work for a major international anti-poverty organization and primarily focus on policy and private sector.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you, Ernesto. Emerita.
Sure, thanks. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. So I wear a couple of hats. I will start with Community Service Society. So I'm the Vice President for Policy Research and Advocacy at the Community Service Society of New York. We're an independent nonprofit organization focused on powering a more equitable New York in several ways. And to say New York, I mean the city and the state. And we focus on affordable housing, on healthcare, on addressing the criminal justice system and the inequities there. We do policy research and advocacy, and we also provide direct services. In my role, I'm the Vice President for Policy, and so we're kind of the brain trust of the organization, if you will. So we are the data and the policy analysts that kind of cook up our policy solutions, and we also combine our policy solutions with on-the-ground grassroots advocacy. So for example, in New York right now, we're pushing against everything from luxury subsidies for very rich real estate investors so that we can move those monies over to affordable housing for low-income tenants, for example. We also do a lot of work with street vendors who are largely immigrant, undocumented in New York. Before this life, I was a diplomat with the State Department. So I was with them for about 10 years. I'm also a fellow with the Soufan Center. It's a global center focused on independent research on national security and foreign policy. I kind of am in the middle of blending my international and domestic background. So I'm happy to talk about that more because I feel like, we'll get to this later, but, your career is less like a ladder and more like a jungle gym. Like you're always kind of climbing and trying to figure out what's next. And that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Great, thank you. Lucero.
Great, thank you, Soledad, and everyone at the Latin American Institute for the invitation. My name is Lucero Ortiz, and I am the Director of Partnerships and Capacity Building for KIND, which is Kids in Need of Defense. KIND is an organization in the United States and which has now become a global organization with offices in Mexico, Central America, and Europe. And our sole purpose is to provide legal representation and protection for unaccompanied migrant children who travel across any border by themselves or start out with family members and are for whatever reason separated from that family. In the United States, we have 11 offices across the country and provide direct legal representation, but also have a pro bono model where we train a cadre of different attorneys in the private sector, in legal clinics and other places to make sure that they are also able to provide legal representation for those children. So across our direct attorneys and the pro bono network that we work with, we're able to represent over 5,000 children every year. And that number may sound impressive, but it's actually really a drop in the bucket in terms of the need is really substantial. And so it's always important to collaborate with others and to create networks of support. And KIND has been really at the crossroads of so many different efforts to ensure that we're working in a collaborative way. And I am based in Mexico City. We launched the KIND Mexico office 3 weeks before the pandemic started. So I was actually in Mexico City when the WHO announced the pandemic. And so returned to my then home in Washington, DC, and was working remotely for a couple of years. And really every day was working in Mexico from the comfort of my DC home. And now am in Mexico City and doing work to really bolster the systems to protect migrant children in Mexico, given that more and more Mexico is not just a transitory country, it is becoming a country of destination, and the systems of protection there are really in many ways in need of support and further development to ensure that they're able to provide that protection for migrant children. I think, you know, we're gonna, as Emerita mentioned, we're gonna talk a lot about different things, the crossroads of our personal careers. And I'll just start by saying that I am the daughter of Mexican immigrants from Zacatecas, Mexico. And I had thought about working internationally, but never really thought that I would do it in my career because I was so focused on domestic issues. And so it's really interesting to be in this position now to be working on domestic issues, but really from a regional lens and thinking about how these issues are really international and are happening worldwide. And that the knowledge and skills that I've learned domestically in the US are applicable and transferable internationally as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Lucero. And it leads into sort of my next question. And we'll start with Ernesto. Tell us about your background. Did your parents work in international affairs? Did their, you know, Lucero's parents were from Zacatecas, Mexico. Did your family's personal story influence your path? Did you grow up traveling? What sort of led you to this nonprofit sector? Ernesto.
Sure. Yeah, no, and I think Lucero did a great segue into this. I'm also the son of immigrants. My parents are Colombian from Bogota, came to the States to study, and they actually split up while they were here, and I stayed with my mom. My dad went back. So I actually grew up split between the two countries, between the two cultures, traveling down to Colombia to spend the summers during my summer breaks at school with my dad and my extended family, and then living in New York with my mom. And you know, I think that connection between being both Colombian and American and trying to find a way in a place where I didn't really feel like I 100% belonged to either category, but at the same time I felt like I belonged to both, was really formative in my development and in sort of my thinking about who I am, but also sort of my understanding that there are different things in the world than what, you know, you see when you spend your whole life in only one place or one culture. And in particular, during my visits to Colombia, we traveled around a lot, and I had the opportunity to see a lot of parts of Colombia, which is a very, very varied country with a lot of different climates and a lot of different regional cultures. And yeah, that really influenced me a lot and led me to be interested in an international perspective, and to also be open to understanding that there are different ways of understanding the same lived experience that we might have. So yeah, that was very influential. I always knew that I wanted to make some kind of a difference, and I was always interested in international politics, in international history and global history. And I had the tremendous opportunity just after undergraduate to work briefly at the UN Development Program, the United Nations Development Program, where I was an assistant on a task force that was focused on Afghanistan. And this was right when the United States was invading Afghanistan after 9/11. So it was a moment of tremendous sort of upheaval. And I was a very sort of junior person in a room full of people who had been steeped in Afghanistan policy for decades, sort of dealing with one of the greatest sort of momentous, challenging moments in their professional careers. And to see them do that work and and be part of it in sort of this small way really led me to decide that I wanted to do a career in international affairs, which then led me to go do a master's in it subsequently, and not sort of stay at a staff level or at a support level in the organization. So I'll stop talking there, but there's more depth to plumb here, and I'm really eager to hear what Emerita and Lucero say to this question as well.
Thanks, Ernesto. Emerita, tell us about your familial and cultural and the influences you grew up with that helped shape this.
Sure. Well, I'll say it definitely happened by accident. It was not intentional, I think, in any way. But I grew up, I'm Puerto Rican. I grew up in the Bronx, and so I have a lot of obviously like cultural ties with Latinos and my Latinidad, I would say. I didn't grow up with a lot of exposure to international affairs at all. I grew up in, like a 2-bedroom apartment, a neighborhood for like one apartment for 18 years. Like that was my neighborhood. That was my place. And my parents also didn't have a lot of money, so we didn't travel internationally. But I will say that I went on a high school trip when I was, I want to say a sophomore. And it was one of those trips where you sell candy for half of it and the school subsidizes the other half, and you get to go on this trip. And it kind of opened my world. We went to Spain, France, and Italy. It was an amazing trip. And it was my first exposure to just being abroad, getting on a plane for a long period of time, kind of like that sort of thing. And then, that led me, down the line. I went to NYU for undergrad. And it was at that time when I got exposed to just the internationalness of New York City, and just understanding sort of the international affairs and wanting to study it and wanting to be more involved in just what was going on in the world. And I applied, and by the grace of God, I got into a program called the Thomas R. Pickering program, which is a program that puts you on a path to join the Foreign Service. And it was, again, kind of by mistake. I was Googling because I wanted to major in, I think it was international business or something like that at NYU. And it was too late for me to make a switch. And I had to major in history or I wouldn't graduate on time. So I said, okay, I have to graduate. My parents will kill me. I have to graduate. So graduate and then figure out what's next. So I was looking for ways to kind of get more involved. I stumbled on this fellowship. By the grace of God, I got it. And that kind of put me on a path because I was interested in both foreign affairs, but also public service. And how can I serve in government? How can I serve people? So that's kind of how it all came about, not intentional.
Great, thank you, Marita. Lucero.
Great. Well, I grew up in the Bay Area in San Jose, California. And I grew up in a very diverse community. As I mentioned, my parents are from Mexico, and many of my neighbors were also children of immigrants or refugee themselves from Vietnam, Central America, and India. So some of my best friends are really from all over the world. And the local supermarket that we would shop at was an Asian market, a Pan-Asian market. And so you would hear all these Asian languages, mostly Chinese. And I always was so curious as to what folks were saying and was just really interested in learning other languages and traveling the world. And it's not something that my parents really exposed us to, except for the fact that, they migrated from one country to another, which is in and of itself a huge feat. But, anytime we traveled, like Ernesto mentioned, we would travel back to Mexico every summer, every break that we had. So I really grew up on both sides of the US-Mexico border, very bicultural, very bilingual. And so there wasn't really any conversation about other countries or traveling really internationally. And I, again, because of the neighborhood and my colleagues and classmates, I was really interested in going beyond just US and Mexico. And so when I was in college, in undergrad, I decided to take another language. And so I started studying Italian and was able to study abroad in Italy. But really, I wanted to study abroad in Mexico City and was able to stay an extra year in college to do that. And again, as the daughter of Mexican immigrants, to be able to study abroad in Mexico City really opened up my world, even to my own identity and my own history, because Mexico City is such an international and metropolitan city, and it's such a hub of culture and history and cuisine. And it's so different from the people that I grew up with, right? Who were, my family's very from a rural community, were subsistence farmers until they migrated, had low levels of education, were very conservative, very religious. And I show up in Mexico City and it's everything under the sun. It's such a diverse city, such diverse individuals. And so again, I think these experiences have continued to just open up my horizons and my interest in being a global citizen. But as I mentioned earlier, the issues that I'm most passionate about and wanted to really dedicate my career were immigrants' rights and racial justice, as well as educational equity. I am proof that education is really the opportunity to make a difference, right? And to have upward mobility and to have opportunities that our parents didn't have or past generations didn't have. And so through college and grad school, I went to law school. I'm an attorney. And so that was really my focus. And I didn't really think, even though I was really interested from a young age in learning different languages and traveling, I didn't think I could work internationally because, again, my issues were really focused on immigrants' rights in the United States and educational equity here. And it wasn't until just a couple of years ago that I had the opportunity to travel to El Salvador to learn more about the history about the Civil War and the Exodus in the 80s and 90s. And it was there that I really started to understand how important it is to understand the histories of our countries and how they impact the communities in the United States. And at that time, I understood more and more, and it's something I knew, but again, it took me time to really appreciate that immigration in the United States is a regional issue. It really needs to be addressed in a regional way. And it can't just be thought about in kind of this very myopic domestic policy approach. It really needs to have a foreign policy and a diplomatic and there's obviously international development, so many other, if you want to talk about intersectionality, migration is really one of those issues, right? There's so many different factors that impact it. And so again, I'm really excited to be able to now think about these issues in a more regional way, to think about in immigration, we talk so much about the push and pull factors, right? And so it's not just people coming to the United States because it's the greatest country in the world. It is a fantastic country, but there are other fantastic countries. And why is migration happening the way that it is? And we see the changes regionally where folks are actually migrating internally within their continents, right? So we have Venezuelans now going to Peru and Colombia as opposed to the United States. There's still some of them coming here. And what's happening in those countries that are now receiving large numbers of migrants, or Costa Rica or Panama, who are receiving Central Americans. So again, I think for me, there's lots of twists and turns in my career, but as you can tell, there's definitely a strong thread in terms of my interest and the way that they've been able to develop, and the ways that policy, from the United States has in some ways created opportunities that weren't necessarily there in the past.
Great, thank you, Lucero. And just a little plug, I'm from New Mexico. I spent, most of my life in New Mexico. I did not travel growing up until I was in college. And I was able to break into the foreign policy space and have done diplomatic work. So if you're from New Mexico and maybe you didn't travel a whole lot, you can definitely still break into these types of careers. So Lucero, you were talking about your law degree. Now, each of you have either gone to law school or to graduate school. And I think that it's important for people to understand how that decision was made. I know with the UN, and you alluded to this, Ernesto, that in order to reach certain levels, you have to have a graduate degree. Tell us a little bit about that. If you studied any foreign languages, Lucero also mentioned the study abroad. How important were those different factors in getting to where you are? Ernesto.
Sure, yeah, no, I mean, I think this is a really important sort of decision point for folks to make. And I think there's going to be different right answers for different people. I really agree with what Emerita said, that careers are not a progression. They're not a direct ladder. They're almost never sort of an intentional structure that you know where you're going. You develop a plan over 20 years. It's moments of opportunity that sort of that have, and moments of serendipity. But then there are these sort of moments where you make a decision that opens some doors and closes others, right? So the thing with graduate school is, for me, it was a no-brainer because at that moment, I was very certain that I wanted a career in the United Nations system. And I was an assistant, and I knew that if I didn't get a graduate degree, I couldn't rise above the level of being an assistant, and I could make a career out of being an assistant that would have been fulfilling and would have paid well and would have had job security. But at the time I saw the professional class of colleagues, and I saw the work that they were doing, and I wanted to be one of them. And so I left to go do that. And life took me in a different direction. I ended up not working in the UN system. I don't regret having done the master's program. I did a master's in international affairs. And it really, there were two tremendous benefits. One is that credentialing benefit, which did come into play in later contexts. When I went to work in government, for instance, it definitely factored into what GS level I was going to be determined for me, which determined my pay and opportunities for moving up and applying to different jobs. It's always a huge asset in job interviews. It gives you that sort of definitely a strong sort of reference set that people sort of make assumptions about. But the other big benefit was just the people that I met along the way and the experience of it, and some lifelong friends that I never would have encountered otherwise from different parts of the world were made in that. And so and then the offset is that I'm in student loan debt still, and will probably be for the foreseeable future in my life. And that means every month, a significant chunk of my paycheck. So whatever more money I'm making is generally offset by that. So really, in terms of money, it kind of evens out, but in terms of the experience of it and the opportunities for work, it has been beneficial. But it's not necessarily for everyone. And I think that there are ways of moving up and finding the opportunities through other paths. So the other point I wanted to make on this question is in terms of languages. So obviously I speak Spanish, grew up speaking Spanish, and that bilingualism has been such a tremendous asset over the years. There have been so many circumstances in which my ability to bridge the gap between two folks who spoke different languages, or to be able to talk in their native language to a worker, to be able to talk in sort of professional English to someone who would judge me if I didn't otherwise. The ability to sort of move in those two worlds has been super key. And it also wasn't a given that I would have the ability to work and write in Spanish. So I actually had to take Spanish at a bilingual level in college in order to really shore up my ability, because I spoke it, I grew up speaking it, but I didn't know where to put the tildes. I didn't know, the grammar, and it was really good that I did that actually in high school and then in college, because it gave me an opportunity to really deepen that and be able to work professionally in Spanish as well, which I think it's important. It's important to not just be able to speak, but to be able to write and interact professionally there.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ernesto, especially there's so many heritage speakers of so many different languages, and we pick up, certain ways of speaking from our family, but it's a very different thing to speak and be able to write and to communicate on a professional level that is often very necessary if you do want to pursue careers in other countries. Emerita, tell us about your.
Sure. So yeah, I have a grad degree in public policy, and how I got that grad degree was through the Pickering Fellowship. So it put you on a path to join the Foreign Service, and the fellowship helped to pay for my undergrad and all of my graduate school education. So I was really lucky. I went to Harvard, and I have a master in public policy from the Kennedy School. And what I'll say about grad school, and I think it's important that you have an advanced degree if you can get one. I think it's incredibly important because it provides you a basis, a foundation in either international affairs or public policy or just the realm that you want to work in. I think it's important. I do want to say that structurally, foreign policy and national security, international affairs, there is bias there, you know, and there is bias towards those who have these advanced degrees and those who have Ivy League degrees. And it's something that I am trying to work against myself and trying to bring up folks. So you don't necessarily, I think it's great to have international experience. It's wonderful. And everyone who can get the opportunity should get it, should fight for it. But at the same time, it's hard because what I want to do and what I'm working on doing is getting more people, for example, from the city universities and the public universities in New York to get into the Foreign Service. And some of them may not have international experience because, for example, you know, to get an international internship, they're unpaid. Who can afford to take unpaid internships? Those who might be more privileged than others. So it's a balance, and it's like structural, right? But I will say that your graduate degree is important. Studying abroad is important if you can have that opportunity. I studied abroad in Spain while I was at NYU, tremendous opportunity. I'm also a heritage speaker, and I actually grew up speaking Spanish with my grandmother, but mostly English. So I ended up getting, when I went, my first tour was to Brazil. And so I got training in Portuguese, and then I went to serve in Colombia. Actually, so Ernesto, I lived in Colombia in Bogota for 2 years, which I loved. And I got a top off in Spanish. Like I got trained for a little while in Spanish. And it was great. And I loved being there for so many reasons, because one, I wanted to really like get my Spanish to where I wanted it to be. And I wanted to really be conversational and, you know, like intellectual with my Spanish. And I'm so grateful for that opportunity to have that and to do that. But the other thing I'll say is mentorship's important. Networks are important. So even in the programs that you're in now, make friends, build networks, get mentors. And, you know, sometimes it's not always looking up at the person who's like an ambassador, who's like a director, but it's also who's around you and building relationships with who's around you, because you don't know where they're going to be in 5 years, you know where they're going to be in 10 years, how you can help them, how they can help you, how you can help each other to build and to get the jobs that you want. So I'll say that, but I just want to emphasize, for me, especially the last 2 years, I've gotten really good mentorship, and that's helped me to think very differently about my career and about where I want to go and the things that I want to do.
Great, thank you, Emerita. And, you know, networks, you're absolutely right about that. You know, Ernesto and Lucero, I worked with them at the Department of Labor, and I worked with Emerita at the State Department. So these relationships are relationships you're going to have for years. Lucero, you're the lawyer on the panel. So, you know, tell us about your experience in getting a higher education.
I mean, I'd rather not, because, you know, every time I talk about going to law school, I have to talk about the debt. So as Ernesto mentioned, it is definitely, you know, short-term sacrifice for long-term gain. And it's not necessarily just a financial gain, but it definitely opens up so many doors. It expands your network. It allows you to have opportunities for different internships. So, you know, I definitely want to uplift everything that my fellow panelists said, and really talk about internships. So I know that internships can be really difficult, particularly for folks who have families, or, you know, have to work while they go to school, or just have other family responsibilities. So I really understand that can be a challenge. But I will tell you that having hands-on experience really makes such a difference, particularly in this field. So being able to either go abroad and do an internship abroad, or work at an organization that is working with other countries is really, really key, because it really does helps you to understand some of the complexities and really overall the differences between for instance, the legal systems, right? So in Latin America, there's a very different legal system than we have in the United States. And there's been reform in many different countries where they are actually trying to adopt similar systems to the United States. So I have several friends who are prosecutors and who have worked in the courts in the United States, who are actually going to Latin American countries to serve as advisors for these reforms. Right, so being able to do that and to understand some of those differences is really important, and of course the language skills is key. I again will echo everything that Ernesto and Emerita mentioned about being able to just really speak the language in a professional manner and be able to write and communicate with folks in a professional manner. That is a lifelong journey. I am a self-professed pocha. Again, I learned Spanish is my first language, but I'm most comfortable in English. And so learning to work in a professional environment has been intimidating, has been exhilarating. It's been all of the emotions. It's been a roller coaster. And I've learned so much in the last 2 years, and I continue every day. I feel like I learn a new word or a new way to express an idea. And again, I think those are all things that you can also pick up in internships and hands-on experiences. So as much as those can be challenging, if you're able to make it work with your schedule and your work schedule or family schedules, I highly recommend it.
Thank you, Lucero. So we actually had 2 panels previous to this on joining the State Department, where we talked about the Pickering and Rangel Fellowship and other programs. We also had a panel on the Peace Corps. So for any of you students who are interested in either of those things, I think you can probably find links to those panels, if, or email me or Lenny, and we can try to direct you to those if that interests anyone. So Lucero, I'm going to start with you now and kind of go reverse order. What have been some of your biggest challenges and disappointments that you've had to overcome? I mean, we all know that these jobs are very hard. Talk to us a little bit about some of the difficulties and things that you've had to overcome.
I mean, I think it's always going to be a challenge when you're in a new environment. So again, as I mentioned, I grew up going to Mexico every single summer. I spent a lot of time there as a kid and as an adult as well. And it's totally different to live in another country. Even if you visited and you're very familiar, as somebody who's grown up in the United States, I'm used to certain systems and certain ways of interacting with government agencies, or even just with customer service, right? So there's certain expectations and just different ways of communicating and getting things done. And so I think it's really important to take that into account and to really try to learn as much as possible, right? So I think in many ways you have to take a step back to the systems that you're used to and really learn to thrive in this new environment. And so there's such a strong support network with human rights advocates and immigrant rights advocates in Mexico and also in Central America. And I really am so fortunate to work with these folks who are, again, so passionate. And it's so different to also be in an environment where some of these folks are literally putting their lives on the line to do this work. And I think that that's very different in the United States, where we're very privileged to do the work that we do, but we have certain protections in the United States that not our colleagues in other parts of the world do not have. And so it's this constant balancing of where do you push and where do you really take a step back and learn and support. And I think in many ways, when you're doing social justice work, right, you really have to understand that it's that long curve of justice, right? And so that long arc of justice. And so it can be frustrating sometimes when you work so hard and there's setbacks in the work that you're doing, whether they're legislative or on a case-by-case basis. But I think it's really important to foster and develop the infrastructure and support leaders in communities that can really make the difference in the long run. So I know it's in some ways it's abstract, but it's this constant balancing and just really being humble and putting ego aside and being open to learning and constantly knowing that that there are going to be different ways of doing things, and so it's just a matter of bringing your knowledge to the table, but then also trying to listen and understand other perspectives.
Great, thanks. Emerita. You're on mute.
I'm always on mute. So I think one perspective is being sort of the individual in the system, like in international affairs and working with others. And I think the other perspective is the actual work. So I'm going to speak from first, like just being someone who is Latina, kind of, underrepresented in this field is tough. And I think in the beginning, I will say that I questioned a lot of whether I belonged in this space and like whether I'd be successful in this space, because I was around a lot of people who didn't have the same experiences I had. So that was a challenge for me, and kind of finding the right people to get mentorship from and to look up to. That was tough. I think also, and I think this is the case whether it's government or nonprofit, in thinking through, or being told rather, like this is the policy, whether you're talking about an international issue or a domestic issue, and you have to do it even though you don't agree with it. And it's something, voicing your opinions or standing up or being, like speaking to an ombudsperson, or, like how do you speak out when you disagree in a space where that's generally, it can be difficult, right? And I think I've seen that in the administrations over time, in government. I see it now in my current role, how to speak up, when to speak up, being strategic about how to push back. I think that's been difficult over time. And then the work itself, and I'll say, for my time in the State Department, moving every 2-3 years to a different post was tough, because you're learning a whole new set of issues. I served in the Philippines, I served in Brazil, Colombia, Pakistan, the UN, and Washington. So, and that was over the span of 10 years. So I was moving around all the time, having to learn a whole new set of issues, which is like super exhilarating and exciting, but also it's like you're starting again, you're starting anew, you're doing something different. So it's almost caused me to be, after 2-3 years of a job, I'm like, I'm bored. Like, you're so used to it, but it's also like it's in one way it's great, in another way it's challenging, because you always have to kind of like learn, and you're kind of always a new person learning something new. So I'll leave it there, but I think transitioning has been a challenge for me.
Thank you, Emerita. Sort of sticking in that same frame, and feel free to expand on this, Ernesto, but my understanding is you each identify either as Latino, Latina, Latinx, or as a person of color. Emerita, you talked about this, and Ernesto, feel free to talk about it or not, but I think I'm interested in knowing from the three of you sort of how your own identity has played out, as Emerita spoke of, in this sector that is at least in many ways, very white and dominated by not necessarily people from, at least with the State Department in particular, it had a reputation of pale male Yale. Lots of men, Ivy League, from sort of wealthier backgrounds. How have you all managed that? Ernesto?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I do identify as Latino, and I am very proud of that. And I think that it is an enormous part of what goes on behind my head when I'm interacting with a world that oftentimes professionally, as you say, is culturally not Latino. And I think it gives me an edge, honestly. I think it provides, there's something that's just so awesome about being Latino. And it's a perspective. It's really hard to put into words, but I feel like it gives me an edge in a conversation that allows me to see things from a slightly different angle and maybe bring a different energy to it. Now, I have to acknowledge a lot of privilege, both sort of privilege in terms of gender, privilege in terms of education. And so I have the ability to speak in a way that that allows a lot of people with biases to accept me more easily into their sort of worldview of like someone they consider who feels safe to them. And so those advantages, I think, have coupled with the advantage of being Latino also, I think have given me a lot of opportunities and privileges in that. So I haven't really felt it as an obstacle. I know that there have been times when there have been moments of racism at play, but by and large, I think that the benefits have outweighed it. Our earlier question was about sort of challenges. I'm not going to sort of go back and dwell on that and move the conversation back, but there have been a sort of few moments of challenge in my life, and I think it's important in those moments to go back to roots and to go back to first principles of what you care about, and remember that this too shall pass. You know, that things may seem terrible in a particular moment, but things always change, and so you just have to kind of keep pushing forward and persevering.
Yeah. I would love to have some questions from the audience. If you have a question, send me a message, raise your hand, let me know that you want to turn on your mic or your camera. I would love to get some questions from the audience for our panelists. Lucero, do you have any comments on being a woman or being a woman of color or who identifies as a Latina in this international space?
Yeah, it's awesome. In my sector, I mostly work in an environment where it is very common for my colleagues to be Caucasian and have majored or done some kind of schooling in Latin American history or anthropology or something of the sort, and have gone to do something like Peace Corps or some type of study abroad, and are really well versed right on the history and the political aspects of Latin America, and you see that reflected in leadership, right? And so it's great that that they're able to have these experiences, but I think going back to Emerita's comment about privilege, right? Some of these folks are able to do these internships unpaid, and then get amazing experience and come back and able to have these leadership opportunities that not all of us can have, right? So that's definitely oftentimes a frustration, even within organizations that are doing amazing work, that you do tend to see the leadership be mostly white women, and the folks that are serving clients directly tend to be people of color. And so there's a lot of efforts. Que en paz descanse, rest in peace, George Floyd. You know, that conversation, you know, really, I think, sparked for everybody in every sector the need to really think about systematic or systemic racism in hiring and promotion, in leadership, and it's definitely something that is being addressed in our sector as well. And it's been time, right? It's overdue. It's well and long overdue to have these conversations, because it really does go back to, again, these issues of access and equity, and who is able to serve and advocate for communities. And it's not necessarily because we come from the community that we're the best advocates, but like Ernesto and Emerita mentioned, there's a lot of experiences and worldview that we were born with, right? And we've picked up along the way in the way that we've grown up, in the way that we've been bicultural and bilingual our entire lives. You know, I always joke that it's difficult to be bicultural and bilingual because you have to keep up with so much gossip, right? In both languages across multiple countries, right? I go and talk to family members and they want to talk about, you know, la farándula in Televisa. So I have to know what's going on with all the novela stars in Mexico, while I have to know what's going on with the Kardashians in the United States. Like, it's a lot. I joke, but it is important, right? In terms of social, economic, political histories and backgrounds of different countries. It is important to have that. And many of us understand it, again, from a different lens, because we've lived in it and have understood how it's impacted our families. And so I think, again, it's long overdue that we really talk about leadership in organizations that are doing international work, and how that's really going to improve, I think, the way that we work and serve the communities that we serve.
Thanks, Lucero. Emerita, was there anything else you wanted to add in that space?
No, I think one thing I'll say is it took me, I'll just share a personal experience. I think it took me a while in the State Department, and that was my first work experience, like full time. That's why I refer to it a lot. to really own who I was, because I entered the State Department at a time, like, I really appreciate what Lucero mentioned about, like, I think the murder of George Floyd changed a lot. Like, it changed it really, it created a movement. And I think that it's been really helpful in thinking about equity like that. And I obviously, like, the murder was appalling. But I think what it did at the same time is it brought around a movement where now I feel like the folks serving in the State Department or in some of these places now, not that it's easier, but like the fighting continues, and I think it's reaping some fruit. Whereas when I started, I remember I was in a country team meeting, so you have the ambassador and all the heads of agency around, and I remember one of the first people to speak, he said, "Good morning, gentlemen, blah, 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 blah." And I'm sitting here like, do I exist in this room? Like, this is crazy. And so, like, this is the kind of stuff people, like, we dealt with. And I can only imagine 10 years before me, or 15 years or 20 years before me, what women dealt with, let alone women of color, let alone, you know what I mean, Latinos in general. So, like, it's just, I feel like we've made a lot of gains, but it's taken some time. And it may take you time to kind of like be comfortable in your own shoes with your own culture and being who you are and showing up authentically. It took me a while to like own who I was. Because in one sense, you show up as you are, and then you have to be the spokesperson for everybody in some cases. In other cases, you have to, it's just all that to say, like, it's important to show up authentically. You may not be comfortable in the beginning, but it's important for you to fight for that.
Thank you. So we have just a little bit, about 10 minutes left. Please, 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 if you have a question, now's the time to ask. I think my next question is really very practical. When you're hiring people to work in your organizations, or you have been a part of a hiring committee, what are the sorts of skills and experiences, characteristics that you're looking at in candidates? And what are some of the areas that people fall short? So when students from UNM are looking and they get that interview, or they're trying to get the interview, what do they need to present? How should they prepare? And what are those areas they really need to work on? Lucero.
I mean, I think it's always important to understand the organization, right, that you're applying to, and how your skill set fits that organization. So I think that's really important. And I think, what Emerita just mentioned is key, right? Knowing what your strengths are, because if somebody asks you your strengths, they really want to hear it, right? Like, what are you going to bring to the table? And how is your perspective different? As I mentioned before, I think, one of the criticisms that we have about it needing to improve diversity is that oftentimes we see people replicating themselves. They just hire folks who have a similar background, right? So, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be when you're not taking diverse perspectives or backgrounds into account, right? So if somebody from, the middle of the country goes to Peace Corps and comes back and is hiring, and all they hire is folks that are exactly the same university background, ethnic background, and that are Peace Corps volunteers, that's not necessarily, going to give you diverse backgrounds or perspectives. And so I try not to replicate myself, even though it's always, I think, easy, right? Because you tend to have this connection with people that have similar backgrounds and similar experiences as you. But I really look to folks who, again, have experience, have done internships, have been a research assistant for a professor, have done volunteer work, and that are able to really work with the community that I serve and that I work with, right? So I work with vulnerable migrant children, many of them who came to the United States by themselves. And so understanding the complexity of that and the challenges that these children have faced is really important. And so being sensitive to those things is really important. And I think, it's really key that when you're interviewing and you're researching organizations, that again, you understand the ins and outs of the organizations, what they've published, right? What their organizational chart looks like, right? Like those kinds of things are important, but also understanding the culture as much as you can. And informational interviews are really key for that kind of thing. And internships are also really key, right? So being able to intern and kind of be on the inside of an organization helps a lot. And so when I'm hiring someone, I look for that. Have you really spent time doing this work in other organizations, or even, you know, the organization I work with? And what do you bring to the table that's different? It's going to help to really make the conversations more robust, and our worldview and our service to clients more comprehensive.
Great, thank you, Lucero. Ernesto, and then we'll finish out with Emerita.
Great. Yeah, no, I think a couple things that I definitely look out for are evidence of sort of resourcefulness, the ability to take on challenges, to find creative solutions, to work around a problem, genuine interest and passion for the work, and sort of demonstrating that this is something that you actually care about, that's meaningful for you. Honesty, sort of candor and integrity for me are really important. I think that is one of the big sort of deal breakers in professional spaces. Sometimes folks, you know, feel like maybe it's best to have a small lie to like get a short-term advantage, but those lies always sort of compound, and at the end of the day, it's just, if you realize that you can't trust someone on a small thing, you realize that you're not really going to trust them on bigger things, and that's a real big deal breaker in terms of people's upward mobility. And the last thing I would sort of say is just, for the interview process, one of the things that is super important to do is to prepare, to think back over your life and the professional work you've had a chance to do, maybe internships, maybe it's service jobs that you've done, and find moments where you overcame challenges, or where that were sort of important moments that demonstrated who you are, and sort of rehearse telling that story, because storytelling is so powerful. And this is something I know from my work as my volunteering work as an organizer, as well as in professional settings. It's just one of the most powerful ways to connect to someone, is to sort of tell them where you're coming from, and to tell them about something that's happened to you and how you've responded to it. It shows so much about who you are. And I think it's a really powerful tool in interviewing, even if the interviews aren't sort of based on that kind of behavioral question. Sorry, that's my dog in the background there.
Thank you, Ernesto. Emerita, tell us about what is important when you're hiring.
Yeah, well, I want to really underscore what Ernesto said about storytelling and narrative. And I'm an organizer too background. I feel like we have a lot in common. But I think the narrative piece is really, really important, because it also helps to connect why are you going for this job, and how is it personally connected to who you are? Because if you can make that connection, that is like all the difference, because it shows your motivation at the end of the day for doing what you do. And at the end of the day, your personal motivation matters a lot, in especially in the work that we do on equity, on international affairs, on policy, and all of that stuff. I think also just generally being prepared, like looking, and I know I've interviewed a lot of people, and you know, some people I interview, it's like, did you look at the job description? Like, being prepared is important, passionate, and also like thinking through what makes you different, you know, like what makes you different, what you think makes you different. Thinking through that and being able to express that, because the kind of team I think about when I'm you know, thinking about building my team is diversity of perspective. I don't always want yes people. In fact, I really don't want yes people. I want people who are going to offer me something different, who might disagree, who might offer a different perspective. Because if you're thinking about policy and, you know, changing policy, making policy, you want diversity of perspective, because that's how you cook it. You know, it's how you think through challenges and problems. So I don't want a yes person all the time. I want someone who's going to kind of challenge and think through ideas and offer new perspectives.
Great. So we are at the end of our panel. I will give audience one more time a chance to ask any questions. Please raise your hand, send me a message, come off camera.
I have a comment.
Great, Maria.
Yeah, I've heard all their I've heard all the speakers' success stories and all. So just because I've heard a lot of diversity comments about it's time that. So do you guys feel like you're holding the
Maria?
possible to?
Maria, you're cutting out a little bit. Can you please repeat the question?
Oh, so the question is, do you feel responsible in passing on and holding the torch to ensure that diversity and equality, not only for colored people, but for Caucasians, for people without color, or for white people as well? Because I heard a lot of comments about diversity, like it's time and all. So now that you guys are all in position and you have a unique background and experience from all the nonprofits that you're working for, do you feel like in the next 10 years, you feel that you guys are the ambassador of change and diversity? Do you feel that responsibility?
Who would like to take this question? Do you feel that in your role you are responsible for encouraging change and leading change in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is that what you're asking, Maria?
Yes.
Okay.
Because I heard a lot of comments about, like it or like the Yale Pale and whatever the comment was. I just, from a perspective of a woman of color, I never looked at my diversity or my color as an obstacle to do the good that I have to do. But then again, I wasn't born and raised there. I was born in a third world country where it's really hard to climb up or to even achieve anything. But I heard a lot of the successes of Lucero Ortiz, Emerita, and the gentleman, I forgot his name, Ernesto. So I heard a lot of like the racism and all. So my question is, do you guys feel responsible to hold the diversity from then on now? Because all I'm thinking is that you mentioned all of that, but the people of color hasn't really rose in the they rose now, they're rising now, and now is the time for change. My question is, do you feel responsible to keep this going, the momentum that we have?
Okay. Emerita, I see your mic open.
Yeah, I think to answer your question, yes. And the reason why I say that is because I think as leaders, like it's one thing to manage and it's one thing to lead. If you're a leader, you're setting a vision. You're setting a vision for your team, you're setting a vision for your organization. And I think that diversity and inclusion is a value. You have to practice. It's like a muscle. You have to practice it all the time. You practice it when you're having staff meetings and you hear everyone's contributing. For example, there's one person who's quiet, right? Like, and sometimes you don't want to, pick on that person, but you want to be inclusive. Like that's just one example. You also want to hear from diversity, diversity of perspectives, right? I think about inclusion when I'm hiring. I think about inclusion when, I'm in a staff meeting. I think about inclusion when I'm in my own leadership team meeting. And I have to tell myself, Emerita, you got to speak up, because if you don't, who will? Like, these are the kind of things. So I think it's important to hold it as a value in your leadership and to practice it. It's something that you have to consistently practice, because that's how it's going to continue.
Great, thank you. I don't know if Ernesto or Lucero want to speak up. Ernesto, your mic is open.
I'll just briefly say I completely agree and admire the way Emerita said that. I can't say it better. The one piece I would add is, I think as a man, there's an obligation, responsibility to also look out for gender justice, to try and be a good ally, to try and be mindful of those dynamics as well. Yeah, I think these are really important issues, and we should practice them daily in our working lives.
Great, thank you so much. Any other questions before we end this panel? Going once, going twice. Okay, I guess there'll be no more questions. Then I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to speak to our UNM community. It's been really wonderful, and I love hearing about all of your stories and getting to share stories from my friends with my UNM community. Lenny, I will let you close it out.
No, I just want to echo the thanks. Thank you, Emerita. Thank you, Ernesto and Lucero, for sharing your career path with us. has been very enlightening and inspiring. Your presentation, well, the conversation, thank you a lot. And we will have another career event at the end of February, and we will be posting information about the topic and more details later on. Thank you all for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Stay
Bye.
healthy.